Okay, here we are, the last or second lecture of chapter 5, which will end module 1. When we left off, we talked about the different classifications of drugs, the four main classifications, which are opioids or opiates, depressants, such as alcohol, barbiturates, benzodiazepines, stimulants or uppers, which are mostly cocaine, amphetamines, caffeine, nicotine, things like that. And then we talked about hallucinogens. In the hallucinogens group, we had LSD or acid, we had mushrooms, psilocybin, we had mescaline, we had morphine. I'm sorry, morphine was, sorry, that was in the opiates. And we had MDMA and things like that. Marijuana, of course, is a mild hallucinogen, but falls in that category, but kind of gets a um, category all to itself, or at least a section all to itself. My apologies. It sounds like I'm getting blown up in email. Um, so marijuana is the dried leaves and flowers of the plant called the cannabis sativa, and the main psychoactive ingredient in marijuana is called THC, which stands for, as you can see, delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol. Now, the THC is what produces what we call the high properties of marijuana, and it does that in the brain by binding to the endogenous cannabinoid receptors. So the receptors themselves are already found in the brain, of course, and these cannabinoids, the THC, binds to it like a lock and a key. What cannabinoids are known to do in the brain is to regulate the presynaptic transmitters. So more or less flow of neurotransmitters. They're not working so much at receptor levels, but affecting release of neurotransmitters. The healing properties of marijuana actually come from CBD. And so you may have seen products out on the market now that are just CBD drops, um, gummies, and other muscle rubs and things like that, which produce the healing properties of the plant without the high properties. Um, and you can get supplements that are both, of course. Um, what are the effects on the brain and mind? It is a mildly addictive substance, meaning that it doesn't take over your brain. There are not too many withdrawal symptoms or things like that. I'm sure, as far as marijuana goes, tolerance is a factor at some point, depending on, I guess, if you smoke it or eat it or things like that. Over the course of time, we find problems with memory, cognitive deficits, IQ deficits as well. But uh, these are symptoms that you find mostly in people that chronically use it every day or quite often. Um, Over a long period of time, and we're talking probably 5-10 years or more, there are possible reductions in the hippocampus, which is involved in memory, as we'll talk about in chapter 3, and the amygdala, which is the fear and rage center of the brain. Both of them are part of that limbic system, which is the emotional center of the brain. Do we see this in everybody? No. Probably the people that use and abuse it more. And of course, leading to these memory and IQ deficits is what we see across the board in drug users, which is impaired prefrontal functioning. And when smoked during pregnancy, there's the risk of it carrying over to the child. So impaired prefrontal functioning as well in the offspring. So it is dangerous in certain times, especially while pregnant. While most everything is dangerous, it is dangerous if you use all day every day. But
the nice thing about this is we find that the addiction is more of what I would call a psychological addiction, as opposed to a chemical dependent addiction. Um, it can be real and hard to break, much like the others, but not nearly as consequential, I would say. So there are positives and negatives to that. Um, this sort of prompts you into the next debate in the next module, which is coming up. And it's asking about the legalization of marijuana. So for years and years, and this is just to prompt you, for years and years, there was talk of propaganda scaring people away from marijuana, saying that it was a gateway drug to harder drugs. Some people still believe that. A lot of research goes against that claim. Um, it was never, uh, I don't know if you'd say, talked about, or maybe because it wasn't researched back then about the medicinal benefits of marijuana and the fact that it's not as addictive. We know that it was legalized pretty much nationally a few years ago for medicinal purposes. It helps with chronic pain, insomnia, um, a whole host of things that especially for patients like going through chemotherapy, cancer patients, it really helps. Um, relieves symptoms of people with glaucoma, which is a disorder that affects the eyes, and like I said, a whole host of other things. So, is it still a drug? Can it still lead you down a bad pathway? Of course. Um, is it as bad as was originally advertised? I would say no. If we think about in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was president, how he really cracked down. So people that just possessed a little bit of marijuana, um, whether they sold it or whether they just bought it, were basically jailed for life, which caused the beginning of overcrowding of prisons. There's many different avenues that we can talk about. If it is legalized as it was in 2017, um, what are the possible pros and cons now, right? For one thing, it's off the streets. Um, I mean, you probably can still buy it on the streets, but these are the avenues that I want you guys to explore. So in the next module for the discussion, I just want to know if you agree with the legalization of marijuana, if you disagree with it, if you're kind of on the fence, is there, and try to cite some reasons why you're for or against it. It makes for a really good discussion, and a lot of times students really like discussing things like this. So hopefully you'll find it a little bit fun as well, and get into a little debate with your fellow classmates. So turning the page to addiction, looking at the properties in the brain, right now we're going to get into the aspects of addiction, the pathway, the neurotransmitters, the parts of the brain involved, getting really into the biological aspects of this. Well, we talked about addiction, and we talked about tolerance, and we talked about withdrawal at the very beginning of the chapter. Again, I did, but like I said, it's the collective we. So um, you can see how all of those things are related. But when we get down to the molecular level, when we get down to the actual biology of it, researchers were really interested to see if the addiction process and the withdrawal process are part of the same cycle. And what they found was that there are different parts of the brain that are responsible for the different aspects of behavior. So the dopamine neurons that go throughout the brain in a specific pathway come from a part in the middle of the brain called the midbrain. And in the sort of bottom part of the midbrain is called the VTA, or the ventral tegmental area. That's where all the dopamine neurons start out before their axons go out towards the reward center of the brain or the frontal lobe, or things like that. And so looking at animal models of behavior, which is what we do in neuroscience a lot, because as we talked about the human genome in chapter 1, I want to make sure that you understand that I told you that computers can't completely simulate human decision making and things like that. And even though animals can't talk, we a lot of times use primates, monkeys, for research with neuroscience, because they are about 98.6% similar, chimpanzees at least, in DNA, and close to 98% from other species of monkeys. And we use mice and rats a lot, and a lot of people don't realize that it's very close. It's about 92% similar in genes and in behavior and things like that. So looking at studies with rats allows us to see a lot of these same aspects in brain structures and genetics that overlap between humans and animals like rodents. So looking at the process of rats, if there is an electrode that basically is put inside that ventral tegmental area. So if you were to inject, in this case, morphine, or we could even do just an electrical process which gets the action potential going and starts the dopamine neurons up. We see that rats will self-inject morphine directly into that area where the dopamine neurons are, directly into the VTA. And when they do that, remember, morphine being an opiate gives you that analgesic feeling. It gives you that pain relief. Rats will keep injecting. They'll keep pushing the lever to inject more morphine into that area, basically until they pass out. So this indicates that this area is very, very much involved in addiction. And as I will talk about, that is the beginning of what we call the addiction pathway, where those dopamine neurons go from the VTA, or ventral tegmental area, and tegmentum in Latin means floor, so it's the floor of the midbrain. We'll go more into that in chapter 3. And so from there to an area called the nucleus accumbens, which is the pleasure or reward center that I talked about. In that area, rats will self-inject morphine, so we know it's involved in addiction. But if you block the opiate receptors in the ventral tegmental area, it does not seem to produce any withdrawal. So in that same area of the brain, we see the addiction process. We do not see the withdrawal there. If withdrawal was part of that circuit, then if you blocked opiate receptors there, you would essentially be able to block withdrawal. Now, going to other parts of the brain, there is an area called the periventricular gray. In chapter 3, we will go over the ventricles in the brain. The ventricles are the sort of tubes or holes where that cerebrospinal fluid I talked about that protects the brain. I talked about this in chapter 1. That cerebrospinal fluid flows through and around the brain and makes that sort of cushion so we don't get concussions. Around one of the ventricles is an area of gray matter, and gray matter is the cell bodies, which is known by neuroscientists to be what we call the pain gate. So a lot of those opiate pain receptors are in this area that we call the periventricular gray, around that ventricle. Now, peri means around, so periventricular would be gray matter around that third ventricle. And we see that if rats are given a lever to self-inject morphine that goes not to the VTA, but to this area called the periventricular gray, they don't really press the lever. So we know that that area, the pain gate, the periventricular gray, is not involved in the addiction process as far as the circuit goes. But once the rats are addicted, if you block the opiate receptors there in the periventricular gray, then you see signs of withdrawal. And you see them acting like they're in pain and withdrawing from it. So the opiates are not, if you're blocking the receptors and they're not working, you're going to get the withdrawal effects. So to sum this up, In the VTA, or ventral tegmental area, rats will self-inject morphine, which shows that it's involved in the addiction process. But if you block opiate receptors, there is no withdrawal. So that's the addiction pathway. In the periventricular gray, the rats will not self-inject more morphine, so it doesn't seem to be part of that addiction circuit. But blocking the opiate receptors does produce the symptoms of withdrawal. So we can confidently say through research that the VTA is in the addiction pathway, and that is separate from the periventricular gray, which is part of the withdrawal process or withdrawal pathway in addiction. Although these two are related, if you are addicted and you don't get the drug in an appropriate time, you will suffer withdrawal symptoms. So it's part of the same overall phenomenon, but in the brain, they are not in the same circuit or pathway, which means that they are independent processes. So the most hypothesized or predicted basis for addiction is that it's rewarding, right? We take the drug and it feels really good and it is rewarding. It's pleasurable to your pleasure or reward center. So reward, of course, is defined as the positive effect an object or condition has on the user. And as I said before, even though we talk about the chemical dependency, the drugs that make us change our body chemistry and brain chemistry, it is not just chemicals like drugs and alcohol that have this effect. The addiction circuit is also rewarding in food, sexual pleasure, of course, which causes those endorphins to be released, shopping, video games, and other sort of things that cause this circuit to activate. This reward system, or sorry, this addiction pathway is the dopamine pathway that we call the meso-limbo-cortical dopamine system. This is the major reward system, and this is the system that's implicated in addiction. So meso means middle in Latin. So meso would be the midbrain, so that starts at the VTA. Through the limbic system, limbo is the limbic system, which is the emotional centers of the brain. So obviously, if somebody is addicted, you see them running the gamut of all emotions, right? And then cortical. So it goes basically from the midbrain, the VTA, to that nucleus accumbens, which is part of that limbic system, part of the emotional system. Obviously, if it's rewarding or pleasurable, it's going to be part of your emotional system. And then up to the frontal lobe, where basically all of the information from your senses and your behavior gets integrated. So the major structures here, again, are the nucleus accumbens, which is the pleasure or reward center, right next to the hypothalamus. The axons that come together from the VTA to the nucleus accumbens, a bundle of axons, as we'll talk about in the next chapter, that comes together is called a tract. In this case, we call it the medial forebrain bundle. And so virtually all abused drugs cause an increase in dopamine from the VTA through the medial forebrain bundle to the nucleus accumbens. And then from the nucleus accumbens, this information gets transferred to the frontal cortex and prefrontal cortex, where it integrates with our behavior, our senses, right? That's why when we're able to reason, use logic, plan out our day, we call that executive functioning. Now you know, with the dopamine system that goes to the brain through the nucleus accumbens to the prefrontal cortex, which coordinates all of the information. This is why once you're addicted, all you can think about is get the drug, get the drug, get the drug, get the drug, get the drug. And then maybe somewhere down the line around 25, oh, maybe I should eat something today. Oh, maybe I should do something today. Forget about and we even see it in electrical stimulation of the brain. I think I have provided a video. If not, I will put it up on the course webpage about looking at electrical stimulation of the nucleus accumbens. And there was a video from the 1950s where there was a female who had an electrode implanted in the nucleus accumbens, and when it was stimulated, shall we say, when the button was pushed, she said that she got a really good sensation. And when the doctor asked where, because this was the 1950s or so, 1960s, she said, down there. So stimulating that nucleus accumbens using electrical activity, using electrodes, caused a pleasurable sensation in the nether regions, shall we say. And this is normally what a picture of the mesolimbocortical system looks like. What you would have is the VTA in the middle of the brain. This brain on the outside is not going to show it to you. But again, when you look through the individual pages that I have written out, you'll see this. But basically, the VTA in the midbrain is where the dopamine neurons start. They go up through the axons that come together as the medial forebrain bundle, go to the nucleus accumbens, which is near the hypothalamus in what we call the medial forebrain, and then from the pleasure center, from the nucleus accumbens to the frontal lobe. So it would be in this area, the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex is where the signal would end up. So meso from the midbrain, limbo, the limbic system, nucleus accumbens, cortical, right? Meso, limbo, cortical system, and that's what it would look like. So reward itself is great, but reward is an incomplete explanation of addiction. I think that I sort of pointed this out at the beginning of the chapter or last chapter when I said that your body really loves what the drug does for you, because it may take you away from reality, it may take away pain, it may wake you up or cause you to be sleepy. And so you like the effects and your brain still likes the effects of the rewarding effects of the drug. But then this is an incomplete explanation, because remember, it's your brain is not just saying we like what this does, but it's a reinforcing property that, wow, we need this. And eventually, when you actually become addicted, then your brain says, we don't just want this, we don't just like it, it's not just rewarding, we need this in order to survive, right? So it's not just a reward. This is an incomplete explanation of addiction. I hope you're following along. So over time, what we find is, if this really was all about the reward, that dopamine, like tolerance, would probably keep increasing the more and more of the drug you take. But what actually we find, looking at research over time with drug users, is that dopamine release to the rewarding stimulus actually slows down again and returns almost to normal, because when you're addicted, this is part of your normal functioning. Once you become addicted, it's like your body is just used to the new amount of this drug. It's like you need it to keep going. But if an expected reward is omitted, which causes withdrawal, then we get that spike in dopamine. And this is just a natural thing that dopamine does. It seems to detect errors in prediction, which is critical to the learning process. So what research on dopamine, whether it's for addiction or whether it's for movement or whatever it is, shows that it increases, the dopamine signal increases. Not only does it signal reward, but errors in prediction. So what does that mean? Errors in prediction that learning theorists consider important. Well, let's say that you are working a job and you expect to get paid $100 a week. I know that's very little, but I'm just using it as an example, right? Let's say that you mow some lawns, or you do whatever, deliver some packages. That's pretty popular right now. And at the end of the week on Friday, you are expected to get $100. It doesn't matter if it's cash or a check or whatever. You're expecting $100. If you get your $100, your great dopamine stays the same. But dopamine will actually spike in two scenarios here, meaning that you're expecting a reward and let's say that the person doesn't show up and you don't get paid on that Friday. So you're expecting the $100 and you don't get the $100. Your brain will spike dopamine. That shows that there's an error. You're expecting something and you don't get it. That is sort of like an alarm going off in your brain. So if the reward is omitted or worse than expected, because that may signal to you, okay, well then if they're not going to pay me, I'm not going to work. Or if your reward is better, unexpected, or better than expected. So you're expecting $100 and you get your paycheck or you get cash and you end up with $200 or even $150, something like that, right? A lot more than you were expecting. That is also going to spike dopamine. So we know that dopamine is involved in the learning process, and that addiction is kind of a learning process as well. So if your reward is unexpected or better, like the reaction of the drug, the amount of the drug, or if the reward is omitted or worse, you don't get the drug, you start withdrawing, right? So this dopamine flow is dependent on these types of things. And this is how the brain learns over time. You learn that that amount of drug that you just took, 1 unit of heroin, right? If I may borrow from my example in the last lecture, that 1 unit of heroin is not doing anything anymore. It's giving you a little bit of a high, but not nearly like it did at the beginning. Now you know you need to increase your dosage. So now you're up to 2 units and now you feel the same high. And then eventually you're up to 3 units and you feel the same high as you did originally. So this shows that our dopamine system is learning in the process. We use classical conditioning by looking at the paraphernalia and the things that are associated with the drug that may remind our brain and start us craving the drug. So the modern theory says it's not just the rewarding factors of the drug, but that drug use is more of a reinforcer. It reinforces the fact that our brain needs it and wants it and doesn't allow us to function normally without it. We have the properties of tolerance where now we have to take more and more doses, which causes a difference in dopamine flow in this mesolimbocortical pathway. And if we don't get it, then that area in the periventricular gray, at least for opiates, is going to act as a withdrawal center. We will start to feel with opiates, if we are using, again, if we're talking about the heroin example, another reason I use it, we will start feeling extreme pain and the withdrawal and discomfort from that, which is telling our brain, hey, we really need this drug now, ASAP. So what's happening in the addiction pathway? In the addiction pathway, we can think of it like a cycle, right? So at first, when you first try the drug, when you first try your unit of heroin from Doug the drug dealer, right? What happens is the drug makes you feel euphoric. The drug gives you pain relief. It makes you feel maybe a little sleepy. And then your body says, oh, we like this. So you take the drug and then you spike dopamine. And then you decide, oh, I kind of like that. So let's do it again. This is where, again, it's rewarding. So it's not an addiction yet. You've just tried it for the first time. Then you do it again the next day or a couple days later. After you do the drug, you spike dopamine. For the first few times, you do the drug, then you spike dopamine in that mesolimbocortical pathway. But then something interesting happens. You start to crave the drug when you're not using it. In this case, what signals that craving is a dopamine spike. So now, when you are actually addicted to it, you're not doing the drug and then getting the dopamine spike. Now it's the reverse order. Your brain is completely dependent on it, and your brain is telling you we want it and we don't have it right now. So it spikes dopamine first, and then you get the drug, and it does that. So when you're addicted, that dopamine spike usually comes first, and that's what gives your brain the craving for it. And if it doesn't, guess what happens? Withdrawal symptoms come right after. So your brain is in this cyclical pattern where it is telling you, and if the brain is responsible for everything that you do, everything you think, everything you feel, every emotion, every word, every movement, every behavior, big or small, and your brain tells you we don't just want the drug, we need the drug, and spikes dopamine first before you even do the drug, that's a really hard cycle to break biologically. This is why that substance use disorders are listed as an actual psychological disorder. And again, this just proves the point. It is not just a lack of willpower. People who are addicted to sugar and foods, certain foods that are bad for you, they'll tell you they feel like they're addicted to it. And again, people say, oh, well, drugs maybe now I can understand, but not food, not gambling, not the internet, not sex, not this, not that. Oh, no, it's all the same. The only main difference is the drugs themselves, obviously, work at GABA receptors, or they work at dopamine receptors or norepinephrine or acetylcholine receptors, but they all have the same common pathway of that dopamine from the VTA to the nucleus accumbens and then to the frontal lobe, the mesolimbocortical pathway. So looking at learning, that's how our brain makes changes when we're learning. Classical conditioning, operant conditioning that you guys learned in Psych 1. This is a form of classical conditioning, as I pointed out in the last lecture. When you go by that bar where you're always drinking, it causes a spike of dopamine because it's telling your brain, hey, this is something that we did. This is the place where I drink a lot. You go into your drug den, your garage, maybe you're just, like I said, you're just getting some tools to fix something around the house. And you see the needle and the spoon and the tie and all of the stuff, and you see your drug chair, all of a sudden, boom, your brain spikes dopamine. You're in that environment. You're seeing the things that you use for it. And all of a sudden, you forget what you were doing because now you're craving the drug. This is all a learning process in your brain. So even though addiction can be beaten, and a lot of people have, but a lot of people have not, we know that it is lifelong. And as I pointed out, 30, 40 years later, people can still tell you that they crave cigarettes or a drink or, the drug that they were addicted to. So it's a lifelong addiction, even though you can beat it. Learning is a huge part of the addictive process. Again, errors in prediction, that's all learning. That's the dopamine spikes. What we see and why we're able to see the increase in dopamine production is increased dendrite lengths, increased dendrite complexity, so thickness, more connections in the nucleus accumbens. So it is basically anticipating more dopamine coming in. We see hyperactivity, so larger activity or more activity in the areas involved in learning and emotions when we're craving it. So dopamine is spiking when we're craving. So we're seeing this activation if we were to hook you up to an fMRI machine. When the drug paraphernalia is in front of you, you can hook somebody up to one of those machines and those pathways will light up crazily. If you've never seen an fMRI machine, they light up different colors depending on how much energy and blood flow and brain use is going on in that area. So in that area, in those areas for addiction, when presented with the needle or whatever paraphernalia, if it's marijuana, it could be a bong. If it is cocaine, it could be a straw or something like that, right? When it's presented, you see those areas going crazy with activity. We also see, because of the addictions and because of the damage drugs can do to your brain and your system, we see malformed dendrites associated with frontal dysfunction. So remember, we talk about in drug addicted individuals, a lack of energy, a lack of activation in the frontal lobes. You're not able to function executively, plan out your day. You're not able to control your behavior. So a lot of people, right, one of the things that the prefrontal cortex is known for is to control your behavior. If you're sitting in class and a professor's lecturing, even if you think it's boring, you're not going to throw something at the professor because you know that there'll be consequences. You know that your behavior is inappropriate. And so your brain just kind of says, hey, you may be thinking this, but don't do it. In drug addicts, you see them offer sexual favors that they wouldn't normally do. You see them begging, you see them stealing and hurting their loved ones, partners, friends, family, because their frontal lobe, their guidance system is dysfunctional, right? So that's part of this, what we call pathology. That's part of the pathway of addiction. So more dopamine spiking, more hyperactivity in these parts, less function of the frontal lobe or prefrontal cortex to control your behavior and be able to plan out your life, plan out your days. Looking at trying to figure out, one of the things that I wanted to point out, and I kind of pointed out, but I should really make a better concerted effort. So here we go. All of these drugs work at different locations in the brain. Like I said, GABA, opiate receptors, CB receptors, acetylcholine, right? Dopamine, norepinephrine, all of those. Some of them work on glutamate as well. We talked about PCP blocking glutamate receptors. So they all have different areas of the brain and different neurotransmitter systems that they target. But the one main pathway, of course, is that dopamine system, the mesolimbocortical system. So one of the things that is very controversial in nature, and a lot of people have a problem with, is giving drugs to or medications to try to limit the addiction or try to break the addiction cycle. So alcohol, which metabolizes, and that's what gives you the intoxication. Of course, the side effects are hangovers and things like that. So with alcoholism, there is a medication called antabuse. And again, if you guys know the idea for classical conditioning, of unconsciously making a connection in the brain, well, antabuse, basically what it does is, first of all, it tastes disgusting. And so if something is taste averse, that pairing it with something else may cause, something that causes sickness may help to counteract the effects of the drug. So with alcoholism, antabuse is a liquid that you take or medication that you take. And what it does is it blocks the digestion of alcohol. So alcohol doesn't break down. In that case, you don't get the fun, drunken, intoxicating feelings. But the toxic side effects are still there and maybe even worse. So basically, before you drink alcohol, you take the antabuse. It tastes nasty. Then you drink the alcohol and you get none of the fun effects, and you get all of the hangover and nausea and bad effects that night and probably the next morning. So the hope is, if you're motivated enough, taking antabuse will, you'll only get the bad stuff and not the rewarding stuff. And so that may be enough to break the cycle. Of course, a lot of times, if people are not that motivated, they'll just stop taking the antabuse because they're like, screw it. There is another medication that is not as effective as antabuse, which overall isn't all that effective depending on the people that take it. So there's acamprosate, there's topiramate, and what they do is they try to reduce the craving aspect through these neurotransmitters called G neurotransmitters. Now, again, we have a lot of information in this chapter, so I'm not going to get into that specifically. With nicotine, the most effective way that people have done this, that people have quit, was to try to wean off of it. So using the gum or the nicotine patch or the electronic cigarette is basically giving them smaller doses of the nicotine without the poisons that you have in the cigarette, and hopefully, as their tolerance and as they're winding down and weaning off of it, that it helps. It's effective for some, not for all, but it is a good idea, because if you're going to get nicotine, at least get it from a gum or a patch, where you don't have all of the poisons from the cigarettes, and you're not blackening your lungs with smoke. Bupropion is an antidepressant, and sometimes through by using that. It's prescribed to help stop nicotine addiction, stop smoking addiction. It blocks reuptake and reduces the nicotine reward and withdrawal overall. So is it effective? I haven't heard too much good news with it, but if people are already kind of depressed and maybe it solves two problems with one medication, it's definitely worth the risk in that case. Heroin and opiates. Methadone clinics were very popular back in the 80s and 90s to basically block, to basically kind of divert the heroin and opiate addiction by using another drug called methadone to try to get them to wean off of it. And those things, that and buprenorphine, which is another type of another type of opiate that's not as strong, and they were hoping that they could wean them off of it, but it didn't seem to work so well. They were approved and popped up all over the place, but did they really get people off of it? Not really. Nowadays, they use an opiate antagonist, so it basically does what antabuse does and blocks the effects of heroin and opiates, and that's called naltrexone, and that seems to work better. But remember, as I mentioned in the last lecture, that a lot of times, in order to get over the addiction, because there are no side effects other than the withdrawal symptoms of pain and things like that, there's no complications like with alcohol, so it's probably better to use an antagonist or to try to quit cold turkey and just give it up, as opposed to weaning off of it like nicotine or alcohol. So again, drug addiction tends to be lifelong. Even if you have gotten over it, you're still under its power because your brain learns and changes and doesn't forget those changes. So several strategies have been developed. Some of them are agonistic, some of them are antagonistic, some of them are just cognitive behavioral to try to think about different things or tell you to take a different, if your commute to work or school makes you go past that bar of yours, maybe, even if it takes a lot longer, go around the other way so you don't see it. So agonistic treatments are ones that mimic the drug's effects, like methadone with less potency. The nicotine patch, less potency, right? So these replace the drug, which can help with motivation. The nicotine patches and gums seem to be better at doing this because nicotine is not nearly as strong. But but methadone has seen to be a bad idea and not very effective because it is a much stronger signal, shall we say. It's a much stronger drug with the opiates, and it's a much stronger physical addiction. Antagonistic treatments are the ones that are the opposite. They block the drug's effects. So naltrexone is used for opiate and sometimes for alcohol addiction, like antabuse. Other medicines like baclofen and rimonabant interfere with the dopamine pathway. Rimonabant specifically is used as an antagonistic treatment for cocaine addiction. Remember that cocaine has to do with the dopamine pathway, increasing dopamine, not just the mesolimbic pathway, but the regular dopamine pathway all around the brain. The problem that we find with antagonistic treatments is they're just blocking the drug's effects. They're not actually replacing the drug. So being compliant with it means that you're okay with that. Some people, they're like, at first they're like, yeah, let's try this. And then they're like, no, I don't like this at all. I'm still drinking. I'm just not getting the good effects. I'm only getting the bad effects. So you're going to go one of two ways, right? If you're really motivated to quit, then maybe you're going to just stop doing it and it's going to work, or you're just going to say this is BS and you're just going to not take the antabuse or the rimonabant or the naltrexone, right? So they all have their good parts and their bad parts. Anti-drug treatments, aversive treatments like rimonabant, which just give you the sickness and don't actually give you the pleasurable effects. again, have been effective, but may not be. So antabuse blocks the enzyme called alcohol or aldehyde dehydrogenase, which is where alcohol breaks down and gives you that intoxication. And basically, it just gives you the immediate hangover. So if people just don't like that and they're not motivated enough to quit, they're just going to say, forget this antabuse, and they're going to keep drinking. So treatment compliance, again, depends on the addict's motivation to quit. There have even been vaccines that stifle the drug immune responses. So the immune system makes antibodies that don't allow the drug to be as effective, and they degrade the drug. Those are, of course, vaccinations themselves, as we probably know, are pretty under scrutiny by a lot of people these days. So those aren't used very often, but it is an option. Reduced serotonin, which again is what we see a lot in depression. We see this in several addictions, this reduced serotonin level. So people are comorbid, double diagnosed. A lot of times it causes depression. So drugs that potentiate serotonin, like Wellbutrin, and if I go back, sorry, really quick, bupropion, which is Wellbutrin, that's the name of it. It's an antidepressant, and a lot of times it has shown some usefulness because serotonin helps you to be less depressed, and serotonin, remember that all of these monoamines kind of work together. Serotonin seems to be the ringleader. That's the one thing that I didn't mention in chapter 2. When we talk about antidepressants and things like that, the reason that those SSRIs work so well is that even though serotonin is just one of 3 or 4 monoamines, it seems to be the ringleader, and it seems to bring the others back in line. So serotonin will, if you level that off, it seems to bring sort of norepinephrine and dopamine to a degree with it to sort of regulate. And if this same idea is used in drug addiction, then maybe if it regulates serotonin, maybe that can regulate the dopamine pathway as well. So antidepressants have been used, especially for people who are depressed and have a substance abuse disorder. So looking at the effectiveness of pharmacological treatment, not only is it not as effective as we would hope it would be, but of course it's controversial because people are taking drugs in the first place and then you're giving them drugs. There was a huge to-do, before I go over this slide in its complexity or in its completion, what am I saying, was a lot of people are talking about, and when Trump became president, talked about the war on opiates. And so rather than helping people to try to figure out ways to get over them, like naltrexone and methadone clinics have gone by the wayside, other drugs have come out, like, oh, well, one of the side effects of Vicodin and OxyContin and all of those things is constipation. So we're just going to give you another drug that sort of relieves the symptoms that come from overuse and abuse of these drugs. So there's a lot of controversy that fighting drugs with drugs, right, to counteract them is kind of a bad idea. And it depends, I guess, on how you look at it, right? Depends on how bad the addiction is. Is it affecting somebody's health? Is it going to help them, right? Things like that. Looking at just behavioral management for heroin addiction without using things like methadone or naltrexone or anything like that only has about a 10 to 30% success rate, because your brain is still addicted. The chemicals are still flowing, right? Things like that. But when it was combined, when behavioral management and methadone were combined in the 80s, success rose to about 60 to 80%. Again, we've learned over time that methadone is not the way to go for this, but we did see a lot of effectiveness, which is why President Reagan originally gave the go-ahead for so many methadone clinics around the US in the 1980s. Again, pharmacological treatment is controversial. again, a lot of people believe that recovery should be the exercise of will, and that giving another drug is just contributing more to the problem than less. These are also the people that see it as a willpower problem and not a problem that really actually affects the brain chemistry. So, do I agree that drugs are not, you don't want to be taking something like antabuse for the rest of your life? I agree with that, but if they are more effective in helping to break the cycle, then I am for that, of course. Um, so that, most people believe that it should involve the exercise of will to a degree, and that it's wrong to give another addict another drug like methadone. All we're doing is subbing out one thing for another. Drug treatment is also cost effective. Addiction costs around $550 billion a year in the US, but every dollar that's invested in treatment saves $4 to $12 per, um, in the long run, it's actually cost effective. You don't have to do the math on that, trust me. One of the stories that I wanted to share with you was about one of my good friends who was actually alcoholic in high school and just after. So around 17, 18 years old, she had been addicted to alcohol for probably at least since her freshman year of high school. So from at least 14 or 15 to 18 or 19, she was an alcoholic. And finally, she started going to AA. She never drove or anything like that. I don't think she had a license at the time. So that was, not endangering others, but she wanted to sober up, and I was very proud of her. And so, I never really went to meetings with her, but I was always somebody that she could talk to. Not an official sponsor or anything, because I was only a year older than her. But I remember that if none of you have ever been to AA, when they're sober, and their milestones of sobriety are coming up, they call them birthdays, because it's almost like they were reborn without the use of alcohol or other drugs or things like that. So specifically for AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, they give you a little token, a little coin, and they call it your birthday for every year that you're sober. So I remember being so proud of her, and on her first birthday, my friend and I went to her meeting because we wanted to celebrate her year of sobriety. And afterwards, everybody went out to dinner because it was like a Wednesday evening. And we went out to Norm's, which used to be in Santa Monica. And it was really funny because my friend and I got a booth that came to, support our friend, our mutual friend. And we were just talking and kind of got lost in conversation. And at one point, we looked around, and majority of the people from that group from AA weren't there. They were gone from our eyesight. And we had ordered but not gotten the food yet, so it was like, well, this is kind of weird. Where is everybody? And then we went outside, or at least I went outside, and I noticed that of the group there was probably 15 of them, and about 11 or 12 of them were outside smoking cigarettes. And so I realized that one of the things that helped these people with the addiction process of alcohol is that they still had something else, nicotine, to fall back on, because it was seen that, at least with nicotine, it's, not going to impair your driving, and it's not going to kill your brain cells as fast. And, so there's that sort of logic behind it. But it's the same idea, I would feel, as sort of methadone, filling it up with another sort of thing, another vice, right? Which may not have been seen as bad as alcoholism. So that was my story. I just wanted to share. Looking at the genes involved or the characteristics of alcoholism, we find that there's actually more than one type. Type 1 is a later onset, where you see people that are older that are addicted, and their behavioral characteristics are different from, like my friend who had it during her teenage years. She had type 2, which is early onset. Looking infrequently, fighting or getting into fights, or being arrested while drinking very infrequently. Finding psychological dependence is a very big deal. They're very addicted or dependent on the alcohol. Having guilt and fear about the dependence, again, as you're older, very much so, very frequently. Are they looking for seeking new things to do and new activities? No, they're kind of stuck in their routine and just doing their thing. They actually prefer to avoid any type of situation where harm could come to them. And of course, their dependence on reward is very high. So this is your typical alcohol addiction, would be the type 1. Type 2 onset is kind of like the binge drinkers, weekend partiers, college type behavior. So before the age of 25, um, their alcohol seeking is very frequent. Fighting, getting arrested, doing things that are, daring, novelty seeking, very high, very frequent. Do they have as much of a psychological dependence as the type 1? No. And they don't seem to have much guilt and fear about dependence. And that may be, maturity in the brain as well. Their novelty seeking is very high, but they don't look to avoid harm. And they don't seem to have a dependence on the reward system, right? That mesolimbic system. So we see very different responses from the early onset versus the late onset alcoholism. And what that points to is a difference in genetics, just like reward and withdrawal, or addiction and withdrawal, were different parts of the brain. What we see here is different types of behavior and dependence levels of the different types of alcoholism. And what that points to is genetics. So we can see at the bottom down here that the representative heritabilities for drug abuse. Alcoholism seems to be 50 to 60% inherited, right? Heritability rate. Hallucinogens, being addicted to things like, marijuana maybe to a smaller degree, or being addicted to LSD or things like that. Hallucinogens is about 50%, and cocaine addiction is even higher in families, 72%. Now, again, genetics doesn't mean that you will get it. And the nice thing about drugs and alcohol is that if there's a family history of it, if you never try it, if you never do it, there's no chance of getting addicted to it, right? And someone who has both parents addicted, they may become addicted on the first drink or first hit. They may not for a long time. They may never become addicted, but your chances knowing this are very much more increased. And so preventative measures can be taken. If you know there's a huge family history of drug abuse or alcoholism and you never go to it, you never try it, you're never going to become addicted. So at least you kind of have that in your back pocket. So looking at the genes that contribute to the addiction process, we see that there are genes that contribute generally. People who have that gene, they used to think alcoholism was its own gene. And people may be more likely to use and abuse alcohol because, again, it is obviously readily available and easier to access. But the ones that are contribute to addiction generally, it doesn't necessarily say that you're going to be addicted to alcohol, right? If you had parents that were alcoholics, maybe they weren't ever exposed to other drugs that they could have been just as likely to abuse. So genes that contribute to addiction generally are involved with these neurotransmitter systems, especially dopamine. And they seem to affect how an individual responds to the drug. Well, with individual genetics, with individual alleles from mom and dad, we also know that different people are affected by drugs differently. So there may be somebody who it takes, very little alcohol to get them drunk. Somebody that we'd call back in the day a cheap date, because you wouldn't need to buy that much alcohol for them to feel the intoxicating effects. There are some people, though, that have a high metabolism of that aldehyde dehydrogenase. So they could drink an entire half a bottle of alcohol before they even get like a little bit buzzed, right? And those people who have a high tolerance to alcohol are probably insert or remove um, genes in the mice and then breed those mice, and the next generation will be born without or with the new gene. So if we take away a gene and then the next mouse is born without it, we call that a knockout mouse, because you basically knocked out the gene from their genome. So there are two genes called Homer genes, and if we use mice that are lacking either one or both um, Homer genes, this regulates glutamate activity, and it seems that these Homer knockout mice, who no longer have one or both Homer genes, are more susceptible to the effects of cocaine. It makes them more sensitive to the effects, and it makes it more likely that if given the chance, they would continuously press for more cocaine. There's another gene called the clock gene. And so mice that don't have a clock gene actually release more dopamine in reward areas of the brain. And so they're more vulnerable to the effects of cocaine. So both the Homer and the clock gene knockout mice seem to be more susceptible to cocaine addiction and the effects of reward. Um, Again, we talked about a little bit about that G allele. We talked about a medication that controls that G allele. Individuals with that specific allele, called the G allele for an opioid receptor, report a greater high or greater intoxication with alcohol. A lot of times people mix the two, which is very dangerous. But those that have the G allele that are addicted to opioids are also 3 times more likely to also be alcoholics or have at least a history of alcoholism. So you can see a huge genetic influence when it comes to addiction. So it's not just the neurotransmitters, but we can also predict based on certain alleles and certain genetics, certain genes, the way that they are formed, if a person will be more susceptible to the effects of drugs and alcohol. So people who do not respond to the negative effects of alcohol, again, there are people who don't show impairment in their motor skills, so they could drink a whole lot and be above the legal limit. But if you gave them the field sobriety test, they'd have no problem closing their eyes and touching their nose or walking heel to toe in a straight line. And these people are actually 4 times more likely to become alcoholic later, because they don't feel like they're impaired, even though they're completely intoxicated. Now, that's not saying that they don't feel buzzed. It's just saying that, their motor skills don't get lower. They don't start to slur their speech, and they seem to be able to drive okay. They're 4 times more likely to become alcoholic and to drink and drive, which is not a good idea. So the inheritable ability to eliminate alcohol from the system for that enzyme is associated with alcoholism as well as vulnerability to other drugs. Looking at genetic efficiencies in metabolizing nicotine actually may protect some people from nicotine addiction, because again, if the nicotine doesn't break down and cause all of those calming sensations or the muscle tingles or whatever, because they can't metabolize the nicotine, then you're just getting the poisons in there and you're not really getting the effects that you're looking for. So those people are probably not as likely to be, not going to be. And these genes also have a um, relationship to personality traits. So what we find with people who are likely to be addicted to drugs, we see this in dopamine levels at baseline. So impulsivity, people that are novelty seekers, the bungee jumpers, skydivers, roller coaster riders, people that are have very risky behavior, have a tendency to also take drugs, especially stimulants. So impulsivity, risk-taking, novelty seeking, and those that can't cope very well to things like stress and the real world. Um, right? One of the main reasons for during a pandemic when alcohol and other drug use increases is because people are unable to do what they normally do and have a huge buildup of stress. And so sometimes they turn to these chemicals as a coping mechanism, right? Some people, it's okay. They can control their drinking or illicit drug use. Some people, it just makes things a lot worse. So we know that the genes that are involved in alcohol addiction, whether you're type 1 or type 2, alter the way that your brain is functioning. Looking at EEG, which are brain waves, sometimes looking at brainwave activity of people that are sleeping, that's the main use of EEG. But you can see that the brain waves are on sort of a different rhythm for people that are involved in and alcohol addicted to alcohol. So we see an increase in the brainwave activity in alcoholics, and we see that same brainwave activity, at least partially, in their children. So that may be an early warning sign that parents, right, that there's a family history of addiction. So what we see is that there's a wave that takes a dip called the P300 wave, and when we get this dip with people that are addicted to alcohol, we see less of a dip. So it doesn't show a big drop in this wave. Of course, these abnormalities are not specific to alcoholism. There are other things that may cause a lack of a dip in the P300 wave, but this is just one of the many ways that we can research and see the effects of genetics on potential substance use like alcoholism. So EEG abnormalities like that lack of dip in the P300 wave are also occurring in disorders that are characterized by behavioral disinhibition, personality disorders like conduct disorder, antisocial behavior, what we see in serial killers, not comparing drug users to serial killers, but there is a pattern of drug use a lot of times in that type of individual, as well as other types of drug abuse. So just showing that there is a connection there, even though the P300 wave itself is not an indicator exactly of what's going on. We can look at brain structure, we can look at brain reactivity, brain wave function, and genetics to get an idea. And it just shows you how complicated this is, and that it's definitely not just a lack of willpower. So this again, you can see this in the individual pages that I made for this. Again, my apologies for not having it, for it not being compatible with my computer. But basically, this shows you the dip in the P300 wave that kind of goes down like this, and people that have the genetics and have addictions, what you'll see is less of a wave. So again, I urge you to turn to the pages. This is why I do both the lecture and the pages, by the way. So we know, basically, in summary, addiction research has very many broad implications for understanding the vulnerability to alcohol and drugs, or even other addictions, and the behavioral inheritance. We know that the behavior results from an interplay between environment and genetics. That was, again, your first discussion on nature versus nurture, and just how much do genetics and biology play a role versus the environment. And just like that debate, does it really matter what the percentages are? Not really, because we know that it involves both environment and genetics. If you never, even if you have the genetics for it, like I said, if you never go into that environment, if you never try alcohol, you'll never become addicted to it because it'll never have entered your system. Once it does, then genetics may dictate more how quickly you'll be addicted, whether or not you'll be addicted, like those types of things. Obviously, these forces operate differently in different subgroups and cultures. Even somebody that does not have family history of abuse and addiction, if they do it enough, they can develop the addiction from that process we talked about, and that mesolimbocortical system. So basically, the overall message here is that it is not enough to assign relative roles to environment and to heredity. We can't just say, oh, if this person has a family history, they're screwed. We can't say that they will or won't get addicted. We won't know how well they can cope to things like stress. So we have to understand the mechanisms. We have to look at the little things. We have to go and look at neurotransmitters like dopamine levels, receptors, pathways, enzymes, the ability to break down alcohol, and all of these other things, so on and so on. So in addiction and all kinds of behavior, we can't just use the old excuse of lack of willpower. We know that our brain literally changes. We know that our brain is learning. We know that lifelong addiction is part of that process. And can we alter these things enough to be able to avoid it, right? We have to be able to look beyond appeals to willpower as the explanation of why somebody gets addicted or stays addicted or relapses back into it. Thank you guys for listening to me. This concludes the first module, so good luck on the exam. And as usual, I will talk to you guys soon.